The rain came down on Route 9, the way it always does in late October in West Virginia. Not politely, not gradually. All at once, like the sky had been holding it back for weeks and finally gave up trying. Sarah Voss did not hear it hit the roof. She felt it. The vibration moved through the concrete floor of the garage, up through the steel legs of the workbench, into her palms, where they rested flat against the frame of a 1971 Harley Davidson Sportster. The rain had a particular frequency. Heavy. Insistent. The kind that meant the road outside would be black glass by midnight, and anything moving fast on it would be moving on faith alone. She had learned to read the world this way. Through surfaces, through pressure and vibration, and the particular way things shook when something was happening that mattered. Frank had understood this instinctively, the way good fathers understand things without being told that his daughter did not need him to explain the world to her. She needed him to let her touch it. So, from the time she was 8 years old and could climb onto a workbench without help, he had placed her hands on running engines, not to teach her anything specific, just to let her feel what a healthy machine felt like versus a sick one. The difference between a motor running clean and a motor running wrong was not a sound to Sarah. It was a texture, a rhythm, a conversation between components that she could read through her palms the way other people read it through their ears. By 17, she had taken every written exam the Automotive Service Excellence Board offered. Frank had driven her to the testing center in Martinsburg on a Thursday while she was between recertification modules, waited in the parking lot for 4 hours, reading a John Grisham novel, and pretending he was not nervous. She had scored in the top 8% nationally on the engine performance module. She had her ASE certification before she was old enough to rent a car. She was 23 now, 5'6". Dark hair pulled back with a shop rag she had stopped noticing was there. Her hands were the hands of someone who had been doing serious work since adolescence. Calloused at the base of each finger. Stained at the knuckles with grease that soap alone had long since stopped removing entirely. Her face was the kind of face that stopped people for a moment when they first walked into the garage. Not because it was decorated or presented, because it was entirely unguarded. She had never learned the habit most people develop of composing their expression when strangers are watching. She could not hear them coming. What her face showed was whatever she was actually feeling. Right now, at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in October, what she was feeling was concentration so complete it had its own kind of quiet. The Sportster on the lift in front of her had been 3 months in the making, not because it was complicated. Sarah could diagnose an engine problem the way some people read a sentence quickly, completely, without having to think about the individual parts. The restoration had taken 3 months because the owner, a retired pipe fitter named Dale Buckner, who had known Frank since 1987, wanted every component either original or period correct. No substitutions. No modern replacements hiding under vintage chrome. Dale was 68 years old and had owned this particular motorcycle since 1974. And he talked about it the way some men talk about a first love, with the specific tenderness of someone who knows the relationship has lasted longer than it had any right to and is grateful every single day for that. The restoration was worth $9,000. Sarah had not let herself think about that number very much. She was aware of it the way you're aware of a bruise when you are not pressing on it. Present. Waiting. She focused instead on the work itself, on the particular satisfaction of returning something to what it had originally been on the fact that every bolt she tightened and every surface she cleaned and every worn part she sourced from suppliers 3 states away was an act of respect toward a machine that had survived 50 years and deserved to survive 50 more. The voltage regulator was the last piece. She had sourced it 6 weeks ago from a supplier in Ohio who specialized in vintage Harley components. It had arrived wrapped in original manufacturer paper, chrome housing intact, exactly correct, for a 1971 model. She had set it on the shelf above the workbench and looked at it occasionally the way you look at the last piece of a puzzle before you place it. She was reaching for it when she found the envelope. It had been pushed to the back of the shelf, behind a box of assorted washers and a coffee mug Frank used as a pencil holder. A standard white business envelope with First Valley Bank printed in the upper left corner. Sarah's name was not on it. Frank's name was. She recognized the bank's logo because she had seen it on the statements Frank kept in the bottom drawer of the office desk, the drawer he thought she did not know about. She should have put it back. She told herself afterward that her hand had moved before her better judgment could intervene. But the truth was that she had been watching Frank for 3 weeks. The way he sat at the desk longer than usual after she went to bed. The way he erased the whiteboard with the week's appointments and did not write new ones. The way he had started making coffee twice in the morning, forgetting he had already made it standing in the small office with a full mug in each hand and looking out the window at Route 9 like he was waiting for something he did not want to arrive. She opened the envelope. The number at the top of the letter was 52,000 and change. The word foreclosure appeared in the third paragraph. The phrase 62 hours appeared in the fourth. Sarah read the letter twice. Then she read it a third time, slowly making sure she was not misunderstanding something. She was not misunderstanding anything. First Valley Bank had extended Frank Voss 2 prior payment accommodations. Both had expired. The third and final extension would expire at 9 a.m. on Friday morning. If the outstanding balance was not satisfied in full, by that time repossession proceedings would begin on the property and all associated equipment. Friday morning was 38 hours away. She put the letter back exactly as she had found it. She pushed it to the back of the shelf. She set the coffee mug in front of it. She stood at the workbench for a moment, with her hands resting on the steel surface, feeling the rain vibrating through the floor. And she thought about Frank asleep in the office chair 10 feet away, with his reading glasses still on and a copy of last month's Motorcycle Trade magazine open across his chest. Frank Voss was 65 years old. He had opened this garage in 1986 with money saved from 7 years of working the line at a chemical plant in Institute, West Virginia. He had built the sign himself, Voss Auto in cycle black letters, on white mounted above the bay door in 1987. He had married Sarah's mother in 1992 and lost her to a blood clot in 2004 and raised Sarah alone from the time she was 6 years old. He had never once in Sarah's memory complained about any of it. Not the money, not the loneliness, not the particular difficulty of raising a deaf child in a county where the school district's resources for hearing impaired students amounted to one part-time specialist who drove up from Martinsburg on Wednesdays. He had simply done it. Quietly, methodically, the way he fixed engines, starting at the front and working back. Sarah turned back to the Sportster. She picked up the voltage regulator in its paper wrapping and held it for a moment. $9,000, minus parts costs, which she had tracked meticulously in a notebook, minus the shop's standard labor overhead. The net on this job was roughly 6,800, not enough to cover 52,000, not even close. But it was real money, and it was money that existed. And on Friday morning, when the bank arrived, it would be sitting in the account, and that meant something. She did not know exactly what it meant. She knew it was not nothing. She was setting the regulator on the workbench, preparatory to installation, when the floor moved differently. Not rain, not a truck on the highway. Something sharper. A single hard impact followed by a long grinding vibration that lasted 4 full seconds and then stopped. Sarah's hands went still. She turned toward the bay door. Through the small window set into its upper panel, she could see the rain and the dark and the empty stretch of Route 9 running west toward the county line. Then she saw the headlight, horizontal on the road surface, pointing sideways. She was already moving. She hit the bay door release with her palm and was through before it had fully opened, rain hitting her, immediately soaking the front of her canvas work shirt in the time it took her to cross the parking apron and reach the highway shoulder. The pavement was black and wet and reflected her flashlight back at her in fractured pieces. The motorcycle was a 2019 Indian Scout, midnight blue, or it had been before one entire side of it met Route 9 at highway speed. It lay in the westbound lane with its rear wheel still spinning slowly. Saddlebag cracked open chrome side panel, ground down to bare aluminum across 18 inches of its length. The skid mark behind it stretched back 40 yards and ended where the rain was already beginning to blur its edges. The rider was beside it. She was on her hands and knees in the road, attempting to stand. Mid-height solid through the shoulders, leather cut soaked, completely through road rash on her left forearm, already visible through the torn sleeve. She was favoring her right side. Every time she tried to straighten, something stopped her about halfway up. Sarah crouched beside her and put a hand on her shoulder. The woman turned fast. Even hurt, even kneeling in the rain on a West Virginia highway, at midnight, her reaction time was remarkable. Her eyes were light gray and completely alert, and they assessed Sarah in about 1 second, with the particular efficiency of someone who has spent years in situations where reading a person quickly was a requirement rather than a courtesy. Sarah held up both hands, palms open. Then she pointed back at the garage, at the light spilling out through the open bay door. The woman looked at Sarah's hands, looked at the garage, looked back at Sarah. "Do you hear me?" she said. Sarah shook her head once. The woman absorbed this without visible reaction. She nodded. Then she pointed at her right arm, which she was holding pressed against her rib cage, and made a face that communicated clearly enough. Sarah nodded. She held out her arm. The woman took it and let Sarah help her to her feet. Her name was Nora Wade. She was 40 years old, born in Lexington, Kentucky. She had joined the Army at 19, done 2 tours, come back to Kentucky at 23, with a discharge document and a preference for open roads and a specific intolerance for being told what to do that she had never successfully treated. She had met her husband Cal at a rally outside Knoxville in 2009 and married him the following year, and together they had built Iron Road MC from 40 members into 400 over the course of a decade. Cal had died of a heart attack on a Tuesday in 2019, sitting at the desk in the chapter office in Lexington with a cup of coffee in his hand, gone before the paramedics arrived. Nora had been president of Iron Road ever since. But Sarah did not know any of this yet. What she knew was that a woman was hurt in the road, and the rain was coming down hard, and the nearest hospital was 22 miles east, and the Indian Scout was not going anywhere on its own tonight. She got Nora across the parking apron and through the bay door and settled her on the metal stool beside the workbench. She went to the small refrigerator in the corner and got out 2 bottles of water and set them on the bench. She got the first aid kit from the wall cabinet, opened it, and stepped back and looked at Nora and raised her eyebrows. Nora picked up a water bottle, drank half of it, then began methodically assessing her own damage. She flexed her left hand carefully, then her right. She pressed her fingers along her right forearm and stopped near the wrist. Her expression changed slightly. She looked at Sarah and said something. Sarah was watching her mouth. "I think my wrist is broken," Nora said. "And at least 2 ribs." Sarah opened the notepad she kept on the bench and wrote hospital. Nora shook her head. She reached for the pen with her left hand and wrote slowly, more carefully than someone accustomed to writing with their right. "Not yet. Someone important needs me tonight. I need the bike running." Sarah looked at what she had written. Then she looked at Nora. Then she looked at the Indian Scout through the open bay door, still lying in the rain in the westbound lane. She went back out and got the tow chains. She worked in the rain for 12 minutes, recovering the Scout and getting it onto the hydraulic lift. She was soaked through by the time she had the bike elevated and positioned under the work light. She pulled on her magnifying safety glasses and began at the front and worked back. The damage was visible and significant, but none of it was surprising. Front fork scraped. Left crash bar bent inward enough to be a clearance problem, but not a structural failure. Fuel line intact, chain intact. She got to the electrical housing and stopped. She looked at it from 3 angles. She got under it with the flashlight and looked at it from below. She straightened up and stood for a moment. The voltage regulator housing had cracked in the fall. Not bent, not scratched. Cracked through. A 2019 Indian Scout with a cracked voltage regulator housing would make it to the end of the parking lot on whatever remained in the battery, and then it would stop and not start again. Sarah walked to the parts shelf. She stood in front of it. The 1971 Harley Sportster sat on the lift behind her. Dale Buckner's $9,000 restoration. 3 months of work. The chrome regulator, in its original paper wrapping, sat on the shelf 6 inches from her right hand. A voltage regulator is a voltage regulator. The specific models were different, but the function was identical, and the fitment was close enough that with 20 minutes of work, she could make it right. She knew this because she knew these machines the way she knew her own hands. Completely. Without having to think about it. She stood at the shelf for a long time. Behind her, Nora sat on the stool, with her left arm splinted against a piece of aluminum stock she had taken from the scrap bin without being asked, wrapped tight with the elastic bandage from the first aid kit. She was watching Sarah. She did not say anything. She did not move. She seemed to understand that something was being decided, and that it was not her decision to make. Sarah reached up and took the regulator off the shelf. She carried it to the Scout's lift. She set it on the tray table beside the bike and began the prep work. She was aware somewhere at the back of her mind of the number 52,000. She was aware of Friday morning. She was aware of Frank asleep in the office with the bank letter behind the coffee mug on the shelf. She worked. At 12:41 in the morning, Sarah tightened the final fitting, stepped back, and looked at Nora. Nora slid off the stool and came to stand beside the Scout on the lift. Sarah lowered the bike slowly. Nora looked at the housing where the repair had been made. She looked at Sarah. Sarah wrote on the notepad, "Starter." Nora climbed on. She started it with her left hand. The Scout fired on the first crank, settled into its idle, deep and steady, and completely alive. Nora sat with her eyes closed for 3 seconds, just breathing. Then she opened them and looked at Sarah, and Sarah could see even across the noise and the distance and the particular gap that exists between two people who have just met that something in the woman had settled. Nora reached into her jacket. Sarah raised one hand. She shook her head. Nora stopped. She looked at Sarah steadily, then she picked up the notepad. She wrote, "You know what this part was worth." Sarah wrote back, "Yes." Nora wrote, "You did it anyway." Sarah looked at what Nora had written. She did not write anything back. She picked up the pen and turned to a clean page and wrote, "Who are you writing toward?" Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she took the pen. She wrote, "The woman who raised me after my mother left. She had a stroke this afternoon. They don't know yet." Sarah read it. She stood for a moment. Then she wrote how far Nora wrote Pittsburgh. 114 miles. Sarah looked at the bay door. The rain was still coming down. She looked at the clock on the wall. She looked at Nora's splinted wrist. She turned to a clean page and wrote, "Take Route 68 north to I-68 east. Connects to I-70. Less traffic than 9 tonight. Road surface is better maintained." She tore the page out and folded it and held it out. Nora took it. She looked at it. Then she looked at Sarah for a long moment with those steady gray eyes. She said something. Sarah watched her mouth carefully. "You gave me your last part," Nora said. "You knew that and you did it anyway." "Why?" Sarah thought about it for a moment. She picked up the pen one more time and wrote on the corner of the notepad, "Because the road has rules. You learn them by living them." Nora read it. She looked up. She nodded once slowly, the way people nod when they have just heard something they already knew but needed to hear from somewhere outside themselves. She folded the directions into her jacket pocket. She pulled on her gloves one-handed, careful with the splinted wrist but deliberate. She walked the Scout to the bay door. At the threshold, she stopped and looked back at Sarah one more time. She did not say anything. She did not have to. She rode out into the rain, and Sarah watched her taillights shrink down. Route 9 heading north until the dark, and the weather swallowed them completely. Sarah stood in the open bay door for a while. The rain came in and wet the front of her boots. She did not move. She looked at the place where the taillights had been. She looked at the 1971 Sportster on the lift, fully restored, except for the component that was now installed in a motorcycle somewhere north of here, moving toward Pittsburgh at highway speed. She looked at the empty paper wrapping on the workbench. She folded it into a square and put it in her shirt pocket. She did not fully understand why. She cleaned her tools and hung them in their places on the pegboard. She turned off the bay light and left the small work lamp on above the Sportster. She sat down on the stool and looked at the motorcycle in the lamp's circle of light. Sometime before 2 in the morning, she fell asleep with her arms folded on the workbench and her forehead resting on her arms. She did not feel Frank come in sometime after 4 and stop in the bay doorway and look at her sleeping there and look at the empty shelf and stand very still for a long moment before he went quietly back to the office. He understood what the empty shelf meant. He had been in this trade for 39 years. He understood the specific calculus of what gets given away and what gets kept, and what that decision says about a person. He sat back down in the office chair and took off his reading glasses and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He sat that way for a while. Outside Route 9 was quiet. The rain had stopped. The road surface was beginning to dry at the edges. The Voss Auto and Cycle sign above the bay door was lit by the single overhead fixture Frank had installed in 1988, the same fixture he had never replaced because it kept working, and he saw no reason to fix what was not broken. In the morning, the bank would send a person. Frank had been expecting it for 2 weeks. He had been trying to figure out how to tell Sarah. Not because he thought she could not handle it, because he could not stand the thought of watching her face when she understood what was happening. That particular unguarded face. The face that showed everything. He had been trying to protect her from it. He did not know she had already read the letter. He did not know that 3 hours ago, she had given away the one thing that might have made a difference, and had done it without hesitation, without resentment for a stranger in the rain on a Tuesday night. He would find out. Not that morning. Later. When it mattered more. Dawn came slowly over the eastern ridgeline, gray first, and then pale gold. The light moving down the slopes toward the valley floor, the way it always did in this part of West Virginia, gently as if it were trying not to wake anything still sleeping. Frank made coffee in the small machine, bad coffee grounds that had been open too long, and carried 2 mugs to the bench. He set one beside Sarah's right hand. He sat down on the folding chair he kept against the wall. He looked at the Sportster. He looked at his daughter. He wrapped both hands around his mug and waited for morning to come the rest of the way in. 2 miles east on Route 9, a white SUV with First Valley Bank on the passenger door was already turning off the interstate. Sarah woke up when Frank touched her shoulder. Not because she felt his hand first, because she felt the change in the floor's vibration as his footsteps slowed and stopped, and then the familiar pressure of a palm she had known her entire life. She lifted her head from her arms and looked at him. He was holding out a mug of coffee. His face was doing the thing it did when he was carrying something heavy and trying not to show it. She had been reading that face for 17 years. She took the mug. Frank sat down on the folding chair. He looked at the Sportster. He looked at the empty shelf. He looked at his coffee. He did not look at Sarah, which was how she knew he understood what had happened. Because Frank Voss always looked at her directly when he had something to say, and when he could not look at her directly, it meant what he was carrying was too heavy for words yet. They sat that way for a while. The garage held the particular stillness of early morning, before the day has committed to itself when everything is possible and nothing has been decided. Then Sarah felt it, the floor. A vibration that did not belong to rain or wind or passing traffic. Low and steady and approaching from the east. She set her mug down and walked to the bay window. The white SUV was in the parking apron. First Valley Bank on the passenger door. 2 people inside. The engine was still running. Sarah watched it for a moment. Then she turned to Frank. He had seen it too. He was standing now. His coffee mug held in both hands, looking through the window with an expression Sarah recognized because she had never seen it on him before. And it scared her more than the SUV did. It was the expression of a man who has run out of plans. She picked up her notepad. She wrote, "How long have you known?" Frank looked at what she wrote. Then he walked to the office and came back with the letter. He set it on the bench between them. Sarah pointed at the shelf where she had found it the night before. Frank looked at the shelf. He looked at her. He nodded slowly. She wrote, "Why didn't you tell me?" He took the pen from her hand and wrote in his large mechanic's handwriting, "I was going to figure it out. Didn't want you carrying it." Sarah looked at what he wrote for a long time. She took the pen back. She wrote, "I already was." Frank read it. He set the pen down. He pressed both palms flat on the bench surface and looked at them. His hands were the hands of someone who had spent 4 decades in this trade. Thick through the palm, scarred across 3 knuckles from a fan belt incident in 1991 that he still referenced occasionally as a lesson in paying attention. The gold wedding band on his left hand had been there since 1992, and she had never once seen him take it off. The SUV doors opened. 2 people crossed the parking apron toward the bay door. The first was a man in his mid-40s, dark suit, the kind of shoes that announced he worked in a building where the floors were always clean. He carried a leather portfolio. The second was a woman in her 50s, blazer clipboard, the professional composure of someone who had performed this particular task many times and had learned to keep her expression neutral while doing it. Behind them, a third vehicle pulled into the apron. A black Mercedes sedan with tinted windows that had no business on a Route 9 gravel lot and appeared fully aware of that fact. Frank went to the bay door and opened it before they could knock. The man in the suit introduced himself. Sarah watched his mouth carefully. Regional Accounts Manager. He said Frank's name. He said the word outstanding. He said Friday at 9 a.m. He said the word proceedings, and he said the phrase all associated equipment with a particular flatness that made it sound like furniture rather than 37 years of someone's life. Frank said he understood the terms. He said he needed until Friday. The accounts manager said Friday was the deadline, and today was Wednesday, and the bank was not in a position to extend further accommodation. Then the Mercedes door opened. The man who stepped out was wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than most of the motorcycles Sarah had ever worked on. He was perhaps 50, well-groomed in the specific way that requires daily maintenance. He looked at the garage the way buyers look at property they have already decided to purchase. Not at what it is. At what it could become once whatever is currently there has been removed. His name was Garrett Cross. Sarah did not know this yet. She learned it from watching Frank's face change when he saw him. Frank had a face that was generally steady. It had weathered a great deal. Loss and money trouble, and the specific loneliness of keeping a business alive on a highway. The interstate had mostly made obsolete. His face had stayed steady through all of it. When he saw Cross, something shifted. Cross walked to the bay door and stopped beside the bank representative. He looked at Frank. He looked at Sarah. His gaze moved across her the way a surveyor's gaze moves across terrain, assessing, categorizing. He said something to the bank representative without looking at him. The representative nodded. Sarah moved slightly to her left to improve her sightline on Cross's mouth. Cross was talking about the property. He used the word corridor. He used the phrase commercial development. He used the term Route 9 Overlay District in a way that suggested these words already had legal weight attached to them. Frank said something sharp. Sarah caught the words no and contract and read. Cross smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who has already seen the end of a conversation, before the other person has understood that a conversation has an end. He opened his portfolio. He produced a document. He set it on the workbench between himself and Frank with the deliberateness of someone laying down a winning hand. Sarah stepped forward. She looked at the document. It was 41 pages, standard commercial restoration agreement formatting at the top. Frank's signature on the last page dated 8 weeks ago. She had not known about this contract. Frank had signed it on a Thursday when Sarah was at the testing center in Martinsburg for a recertification exam. She began reading from the first page, fast, the way she read everything completely and without pausing. She found it on page 37. Subsection 9, tucked behind the warranty language after the liability clauses, written in the same typeface, and point size as everything around it so that it required no particular attention to pass over. Commercial redevelopment acquisition rider. In the event of contractual default by the service provider, all shop collateral equipment, inventory, property rights, and land. Title transfer unconditionally to Harmon Development, LLC, the parent company of the contracting party, within 48 hours of default notice. Sarah read it twice. Then she looked up at Cross. He was watching her. He had been watching her read. He had the expression of someone who is accustomed to this particular moment, the moment when the other person finds the clause and has long since stopped being troubled by it. Sarah picked up her notepad. She wrote in large letters and turned it to face him. You buried this on purpose. Cross looked at what she wrote. He said, your father signed a legally binding agreement. Every word of it was there to be read. Sarah wrote, he trusted you. Cross said, that is not my problem. The bank representative was looking at the floor. The woman with the clipboard had stopped writing and was holding it against her chest. Neither of them said anything. Frank had gone very still. He was looking at the document on the workbench. Sarah watched his face move through something she did not have a word for. Recognition, maybe. The specific, devastating recognition of understanding. Not just that something bad has happened, but exactly how long ago it was set in motion, and exactly how many ordinary days you lived through while it was already underway. She turned back to the document and kept reading. She read all 41 pages in 11 minutes, standing at the workbench with Cross watching her and the bank representative standing near the door. When she finished, she set it down and looked at the last page. Frank's signature, his large, careful handwriting. She picked up the pen and wrote on her notepad. This contract was filed through Harmon Development, LLC. She underlined LLC. She held the notepad up toward Cross. He looked at it. His expression did not change. He said, that is correct. Sarah wrote, when did Harmon Development LLC last file? An active business registration in the state of West Virginia. Something moved behind Cross's eyes. Very small. Very brief. He said, that is a matter for our legal team. She wrote, it is a matter for the Secretary of State's office, which opens at 9 a.m. She looked at the clock on the wall. It was 7:43. Cross closed his portfolio. He looked at Frank. He said, you have until Friday at 9. We will return then with a full legal team. I suggest you use the time to find alternate arrangements for your equipment. He walked back to the Mercedes. The bank representatives followed. Both vehicles pulled out of the parking apron and onto Route 9, heading east, and within 40 seconds, all that remained of them was the sound of tires on wet pavement fading toward the county line. Frank sat down on the stool. Sarah stood at the workbench and looked at the photographs Frank had put up over the decades. Riders and truckers and locals who had come through at bad moments and left with running vehicles. Perhaps 60 photographs on that wall. Some she knew. Most she had grown up looking at without knowing their names. She picked up her phone. She opened the Secretary of State business search for West Virginia. She typed in Harmon Development LLC. She read the result. She wrote the relevant information on a clean page of her notepad and tore it out and put it in her back pocket. She called Dale Buckner from the office phone. When the call connected, she opened a text and typed, Dale, it is Sarah. I need to talk to you about the Sportster. There is a problem with the restoration, and I owe you an explanation. Can you come to the shop this morning? She set the phone down. She went back to the bench. She worked through the morning on other things, a brake job on a pickup due Thursday, an oil change on a touring bike belonging to a pastor from Shepherdstown who brought it in every fall without fail. She worked with the specific, focused attention she always brought to the work, not because she was not thinking about Cross in the contract and Friday morning, but because the work required her full presence, and she had learned long ago that giving it less than that was a form of disrespect toward both the machine and the person depending on it. Around 10, Dale's truck pulled into the apron. He was 68, heavy-set, the deliberate movements of a man whose joints had been through several decades of physical labor and had reached a negotiated settlement with the rest of him about speed. He came into the bay and looked at the Sportster on the lift. He looked at the housing where the regulator had been. He looked at Sarah. She handed him the notepad. She had written it all out. What happened Tuesday night? The Indian scout in the rain, the cracked housing, the woman riding toward Pittsburgh, the decision. Dale read it slowly. He read it twice. He looked at the Sportster. He looked at Sarah. He took the pen. He wrote, Is she okay? Sarah wrote, I think so. I don't know yet. Dale looked at the Sportster for a long time. Then he wrote, I have been coming to this garage since Frank opened it. You know that. Sarah nodded. He wrote, I can wait on the part. Order another one, however long it takes. Sarah wrote, It could be months. The supplier in Ohio. He wrote Sarah, I waited 50 years to restore this bike. I can wait a few more months. She looked at what he wrote. She looked at the Sportster. She looked at Dale's face, which was the uncomplicated face of someone who has decided something and is completely at peace with the decision. She wrote, There is something else. She gave him the page with the information about Harmon Development. LLC. Dale read it. His expression changed. He looked up at her. She wrote, Cross is coming back Friday. He has a contract with Frank. I found something in the LLC registration that might matter, but I do not know enough about business law to know how much. Dale read it again. He stood up straight. He said something. She watched his mouth. He said, My brother-in-law is a commercial litigation attorney in Morgantown. He was already reaching for his phone. The morning moved through its hours. Dale made calls from the parking apron visible through the bay window, pacing in the particular way of a man conducting serious business. Sarah worked. Frank sat in the office and drank coffee and did not say much, and Sarah let him sit because she understood that sometimes a person needs to be still inside the weight of a thing before they can move through it. At 11:47, Sarah felt the floor change again. Not a vehicle approaching, something larger. A vibration with a different character. Not a single engine. Multiple engines. many of them moving in coordinated rhythm, the kind of sound that does not exist in ordinary traffic, because ordinary traffic is random, and this was not random. This was formation. She walked to the bay window. Route 9 eastbound. As far as she could see, there was a line of headlights, not car headlights. Motorcycle headlights, 2x2, running lights steady moving at the same speed, keeping the same distance between each pair. She counted until she lost count. Frank appeared beside her. He looked through the window. She watched his face. His mouth opened slightly. He was saying something to the window, to the road, to the line of headlights stretching back to the horizon. The formation turned off Route 9 into the parking apron and the road beyond it and the shoulder and the field on the far side of the road. They came in slowly, precisely each pair of bikes, finding a space and stopping in sequence. Engines cutting off in a rolling wave that moved back through the formation like a tide going out, diminishing, diminishing, and then an immense collective silence that Sarah felt through the soles of her boots as something she could only describe as the absence of everything that had just been there. 407 motorcycles, she counted later. Mixed club patches, Iron Road MC predominant the patch. Cal Wade had designed in 1989 a road stretching to a horizon with the sun behind it. But also others. Patches from Virginia and Pennsylvania and Kentucky and Ohio. Individual riders with no patch at all. The riders dismounted in something close to unison. The weight of boots on pavement and gravel and the edge of the road came through the floor in a slow, continuous drum roll. Then a pickup truck. Dark blue, older model, West Virginia plates pulled to the front of the apron and stopped. The passenger door opened. Nora Wade stepped out. Her right wrist was in a proper fiberglass cast, white and new from the hospital. She moved carefully, one arm braced against her ribs, her pace measured to account for the wrapped fractures underneath, but her pace did not waver. She walked toward the bay door with the same deliberate authority she had carried in the rain on Tuesday night, adjusted but not diminished. Sarah stepped outside. They stood facing each other in the parking apron, with 400 people watching, and neither of them moved for a moment. Then Nora raised her left hand and made a sign. ASL. Slow, deliberate, imperfect, but completely clear. The sign for thank you, brought to her lips and extended outward palm up. Sarah had taught herself to keep her face neutral in public situations. Years of conversations that happened around her, rather than with her years of people addressing Frank, when they meant to address Sarah, had built in her a careful composure she wore when she needed it, like a piece of equipment. Practical. Protective. She was not wearing it now. She signed back, "You learned that?" Nora smiled. She said something. Sarah watched her mouth. She said someone in the parking lot of the hospital at 3 a.m. taught me 4 signs. That was the first one. Sarah signed, "Is she okay?" Nora's face moved through something. Then she nodded. She said she is stable. They got to her in time. She looked at Sarah steadily. Because I got to her in time. Frank came out of the bay door and stood beside Sarah. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Nora. He looked at the road full of motorcycles. His face went through several things Sarah had never seen on it before, and she watched each one carefully. Nora looked at Frank. She said, "You raised a remarkable person, Mr. Voss." Frank said something, Sarah caught the shape of it. He said she raised herself. I just kept the lights on. Nora turned to the crowd behind her. She was not a large woman, but she had the kind of presence that does not require volume. The gathered riders went still without being asked. She spoke. Sarah caught fragments from her position and angle. She caught the words, "this garage," and 37 years, and she gave away the last thing. She caught the word Tuesday and the word rain. She caught the phrase, "did not ask for my name." She caught the words, "that is what people used to look like." She reached into her jacket with her left hand. She produced a piece of paper. Sarah recognized it before Nora had fully unfolded it. The bank letter. The one she had read on the shelf the night before and put back behind the coffee mug. Her stomach tightened. Later, she would learn that Frank, in the stunned hours after Cross's visit, had left it on the workbench where Nora's people had spotted it when they arrived to prepare the area ahead of the formation. Nora held it up. She said the number out loud. $52,000. She said it clearly enough that Sarah could read it from where she was standing, and clearly enough that everyone on that road could hear it. She looked at the riders behind her. She said something. Sarah caught the last three words. She said, "You know what to do." The sound that followed was not a cheer. It was something more specific and more serious. It was the sound of hundreds of people all making the same decision at the same time. Wallets opening, hands reaching, people moving toward the workbench Frank had rolled to the bay door opening with the old coffee can on it that had held spare change since 1994. Cash. Folded. Thick. Sarah stepped forward. She held up both hands. She shook her head. The movement nearest her stopped. People looked at Nora. Sarah picked up her notepad. She wrote in the largest letters the page would hold, "I did not do it for this." She turned it so the crowd nearest her could see it. The message moved back through the group the way messages move through crowds person to person until it had reached the people she could not show it to directly. Nora stepped close to her. She said quietly enough that it was between them, "I know you did not." Sarah wrote, "Then why?" Nora took the notepad. She wrote, "Because you did not do it for this. That is exactly why." Sarah looked at what she had written. She looked at the crowd. She looked at Frank standing in the bay door with both hands pressed against the frame, the way he stood when he needed to hold himself steady. She looked at the money accumulating in the old coffee can and spreading onto the workbench surface. An Iron Road member set down a folded envelope and said something. Sarah watched his mouth. He said, "VA back pay. Been saving it. This matters more." An older man with a Desert Storm patch walked up and set down a watch. He looked at Sarah once. He walked away without a word. Sarah pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and looked at the sky, and then looked at her boots, and then looked at Frank. And Frank was not even trying to hold his face together anymore. And that finally was what undid her. She walked to him. She put her arms around him. He put his arms around her, and she could feel through his chest the particular vibration of a person who is crying quietly, trying to keep it contained, not managing it. And she held on, and he held on. And behind them, Route 9 ran in both directions through the West Virginia Valley in the October morning light. They stood that way for a while. Then, Sarah felt the floor change again. Different from before. Not motorcycles. Heavier. The deep bass of diesel engines, multiple large, approaching from the west with the authority of machines built for distance rather than speed. She stepped back from Frank. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She turned toward Route 9. Three police cruisers came first, rolling slowly with lights on, but no sirens clearing the road. Behind them, the first truck appeared around the bend. An 18-wheeler, chrome stacks American flag on the antenna, a hand-lettered banner reading Voss Auto across the grill attached with what appeared to be zip ties and determination. Then another, then another. 8 trucks in total pulling into the far side of the road, in sequence air brakes, exhaling doors opening. Nora appeared beside Sarah. She said, I made 2 phone calls from the hospital parking lot. One was to Iron Road. The other was to the Tri-State Truckers Brotherhood. She paused. Your father has fixed a lot of trucks on Route 9 over 37 years. The lead driver walked toward the garage. He was perhaps 60 large, through the shoulders, the unhurried gait of someone who logs long miles alone and has made peace with his own company. He stopped in front of Frank and took off his cap and held it in both hands. He said something to Frank. Sarah watched his mouth from her angle. She caught 2009 in Blizzard, and you would not take payment, and I never forgot. Frank looked at him. Frank said his name. The driver nodded. They shook hands, and then Frank pulled him into the kind of embrace that does not happen between people who do not mean it, and Sarah turned away to give them the privacy of it. She walked to the workbench. She looked at the money. She did not count it. She looked at the photographs on the wall. She looked at the Sportster on the lift. All that work, all that care, missing one component. Missing one. She thought about subsection 9. She thought about Garrett Cross in his charcoal suit, and the particular certainty of a man who has decided that no one will show up. She thought about the piece of paper in her back pocket with the information about Harmon Development, LLC. She had not mentioned it to Nora yet. She had not mentioned it to anyone except Dale. Dale was standing at the edge of the parking apron, talking to a woman Sarah had not seen arrive. Older woman, late 50s, riding boots, dark blazer over a leather vest worn soft from years of use, silver hair, a black folder under one arm. Dale caught Sarah's eye across the crowd. He held up one finger. He pointed at the woman. He mouthed something. Sarah read it. He said she drove from Morgantown this morning. He said her name is Carol. He said one more word. Sarah almost missed it. His mouth made the shape, carefully making sure she caught it. He said judge. Her full name was Carol McAllister. She had been a federal circuit judge for 19 years before she retired in 2021. She had written opinions still being cited in commercial litigation cases across 4 states. She had also, since 2001, been a dues-paying member of Iron Road MC, a fact she had never hidden and never advertised because it was simply part of who she was, and she had long since stopped organizing her identity around what made other people comfortable. She was 58 years old. She moved through the crowd with the complete confidence of something that knows where it is going and has never seriously considered the possibility of not getting there. People stepped aside without being asked. She stopped in front of Sarah. She looked at her directly. Not past her, not toward Frank, not at the crowd. At Sarah. She said slowly and clearly, with the deliberate mouth movements of someone who had been told before the drive that Sarah was deaf and had spent 40 minutes on the highway practicing. I read the contract on my phone on the way here. Dale sent it. I need to ask you some questions. Sarah nodded. She held up her notepad. Carol took the pen without being asked and wrote the first question. When did Frank sign this agreement? Sarah wrote, 8 weeks ago. I found out this morning. Carol wrote, did he have independent legal counsel? Review it before signing. Sarah wrote, no. He trusted the people he was dealing with. Carol looked at that answer for a moment. Then she wrote, you found something in the LLC registration. Sarah reached into her back pocket and handed her the folded page. Carol unfolded it. She read it. She read it again. Her expression did not change dramatically, but something behind her eyes went very still in the manner of someone who has just identified exactly what they were looking for. She looked up at Sarah. She said clearly, how did you find this? Sarah wrote Secretary of State Business Search. 4 minutes. Carol almost smiled. She looked at the folder under her arm. She said, I need to make 2 phone calls. Then I need to talk to your father. She walked to the edge of the parking apron and opened her phone. Sarah watched her for a moment. Then she turned back to the garage. The morning had taken on the quality she associated with moments that would later become permanent in memory. The light was clear and cold, the October light of West Virginia that makes everything look slightly more real than usual. Edges, sharper colors, deeper. Riders and drivers stood in groups, eating from folding tables that had appeared from somewhere. The diner owner from 2 miles east had shown up with his entire morning prep in cardboard boxes and was working out of the back of his van. The pastor from Shepherdstown, whose touring bike Sarah had serviced that morning, came out of the crowd with 2 large thermoses of coffee and set them on the workbench without a word. Frank was talking to the truck driver. The driver still had his cap in his hand. They were talking the way people talk when they have known each other for a long time and are catching up across a distance that is not about geography. Chief of Police Raymond Pruitt arrived in a county car. He was 56, white mustache, the careful, measured movements of a man who had learned over 30 years of law enforcement to assess a situation before committing to a response. He looked at the road full of motorcycles and the line of trucks and the folding tables and the crowd and put his hands in his jacket pockets and stood there for a moment with the expression of a man doing quiet arithmetic. He walked to Sarah. He had known her entire life. He had come into the garage every fall to get his personal vehicle winterized, had been doing it since before she could reach the hood latch without a step stool. He had never once addressed Frank when he meant to address Sarah. She had always respected that about him. He said, I got a call from a bank representative about an unlawful assembly. He looked at the road. Then he said, then I got a personal call from Dale Buckner. He paused. I came for the second call. Sarah wrote, Cross is coming back Friday morning with a legal team. Pruitt read it. He looked at the folder Carol was carrying as she walked back toward them. He looked at the crowd. He said, Is that Carol McAllister? Sarah nodded. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He said, All right then. He looked at his boots for a moment. Then he said, You want to tell me what we are dealing with here? Sarah handed him the notepad and started from the beginning. She had been writing for 4 minutes when Carol reached them. Carol looked at Pruitt. Pruitt looked at Carol. They had clearly encountered each other before in some professional context, because the look between them was the look of people who have sat on opposite sides of a courtroom and have reached over time a mutual assessment. Carol said his name. Pruitt said hers. He looked at her folder. Carol said Harmon Development, LLC filed for dissolution with the West Virginia Secretary of State 11 months ago. The dissolution was finalized 9 months ago. She opened the folder. The company has not been a legally operating entity in the state for 9 months. She looked at Pruitt steadily. Any contract executed under that name after the dissolution date is void on its face. The acquisition rider in particular has no standing because the acquiring entity does not legally exist. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. He looked at Frank. He said, "Frank, did you know the company you signed with had dissolved?" Frank said no. He said it simply without emphasis. Pruitt said, "Did anyone tell you that before you signed?" Frank said, "They gave me a business card. Said they were expanding along Route 9. Said it was a restoration contract." He paused. I read most of it. He looked at Sarah. I trusted the people. Carol said, the concealment of material terms, specifically the dissolved status of the acquiring entity, and the existence of the acquisition rider, constitutes fraudulent inducement under West Virginia Commercial Code. She said it the way she had said similar sentences in courtrooms for 19 years. Clearly. Completely. Without flourish. She said, any proceedings Cross attempts to initiate on Friday are not just challengeable, they are void before they begin. Pruitt looked at his notepad. He said, I made a call on the way here to a contact at the State Attorney General's office. They have been looking at Harmon Development and its parent companies for 14 months. He looked at Carol. They were waiting for someone with standing to file. Carol said Frank Voss has standing. Frank said, what does that mean exactly? Standing. Carol looked at him directly. She said it means you were harmed. It means what happened to you matters legally. It means you have the right to make them answer for it. Frank looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Sarah. He looked at the 41-page contract on the workbench. He said quietly, how many other people did they do this to? Carol opened the folder again. She said, based on what the Attorney General's office shared with me this morning, at least 14 properties along Route 9 and the surrounding county roads. Going back 4 years. She paused. Most of them signed without counsel. Most of them trusted the people. The crowd near them had gone quiet. Not all at once. The quiet had spread outward from where they were standing, like a ring on still water, conversation stopping, attention turning. Frank looked at the ground for a moment, then he looked up. He said, all right. He said it the way he said things when he had decided them, and there was no more deliberating to do. He said, what do I need to do? Carol said, sign an affidavit this morning. I have the form. The Attorney General's office will do the rest. She set the folder on the workbench and opened it to the relevant page. And Frank read it, all of it slowly, and Carol waited without impatience. And when he finished, he looked at Sarah, and Sarah nodded once, and Frank picked up the pen and signed. Garrett Cross arrived at 9:47. 3 vehicles this time. 2 black SUVs carrying 4 attorneys and a personal security consultant who looked at the crowd from the window for a long moment before getting out with the careful assessment of someone recalculating. The 3rd vehicle was an unmarked county car that did not belong in this convoy, a detail Pruitt noticed immediately and noted in his book. Cross walked toward the garage bay with his attorney's flanking him portfolio under his arm, charcoal suit, polished shoes. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the trucks across the road. He looked at the money on the workbench, which had been counted and banded and stacked in the old coffee can, with a handwritten total on a sticky note on the side. He took all of this in with the practiced survey of someone accustomed to walking into situations he believes he controls. He looked at Sarah. He looked at Frank. He said, I understand you have concerns about the agreement. My team is prepared to discuss a transition arrangement that would allow you to vacate the property on a reasonable timeline. Frank said, I am not vacating anything. Cross said, the contract gives us the legal authority to begin proceedings immediately upon default. He opened the portfolio. We are here to exercise that authority. Carol stepped forward. Cross looked at her. Something crossed his face. Brief. He knew who she was. He said, Judge McAllister, this is a commercial matter. Carol said, retired judge, and yes, it is. She opened her folder. Harmon Development, LLC, filed for dissolution with the Secretary of State 11 months ago. She held up the dissolution certificate. The company ceased to be a legal entity 9 months ago. She held up the second document. The contract Frank Voss signed was executed in the name of a company that did not legally exist at the time of signing. She held up the third document. The acquisition rider within that contract therefore has no legal standing in any jurisdiction in this state or any other. Cross's lead attorney said that interpretation is highly contestable. Carol looked at him. She said, contest it in front of a federal jury. Then, she looked at the news van that had pulled up on the shoulder of Route 9 camera already running. She said, while the footage of this morning is being broadcast to however many people are watching, and while the State Attorney General's office is processing the affidavit Frank Voss signed 40 minutes ago, and while 14 other families along this corridor are being contacted by that same office about their own agreements with your client. She said the last sentence very quietly, but it carried. Cross went still. His lead attorney leaned close and said something. Cross did not respond. He was looking at Carol's folder. He was looking at Pruitt standing 10 feet away with his notepad. He was looking at the news camera. He was doing arithmetic. Sarah was watching his face. She had been watching it since he arrived, because his face, like most faces, told the truth that his words were working hard to obscure. She watched him process each piece of information Carol had laid out. She watched the arithmetic resolve. She watched the exact moment when he understood that the situation he had walked into was not the situation he had prepared for. He looked at Sarah. He held her gaze. Then he said something. He said it slowly, looking directly at her, making sure she could read his lips. He said, I did not think anyone would show up for a deaf girl in a dead-end town. The words landed the way a certain kind of blow lands, not with pain, with clarity. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the 400 people standing in the road and the field and the shoulder. She looked at the 8 trucks across the road with their hand-lettered banners. She looked at Nora standing 15 feet away with her cast and her steady gray eyes. She looked at Frank beside her 65 years old, who had placed her hands on running engines when she was 8 years old, so she could feel the world she could not hear. She looked back at Cross. She did not write anything. She did not sign anything. She simply smiled. Not a large smile, a small one. The specific smile of someone who has just watched a man demonstrate with complete precision exactly what he had gotten wrong. Pruitt stepped forward. He said, Mr. Cross, I have a call into the State Attorney General's office, and they have asked me to request that you and your team remain available for questioning regarding 14 commercial agreements in this county. He said it pleasantly. He said, I would recommend you stay in the area for the next few days. Cross looked at his attorneys. The attorneys looked at each other. The security consultant walked back to the SUV and got in. Cross looked at the garage one more time. He looked at the sign above the bay door. He looked at Frank. He looked at Sarah. He closed his portfolio. He walked back to the SUV. The crowd watched him go, not with celebration, not yet. With the particular silence of people who have just witnessed something important and are still holding it carefully before they let themselves feel it. Then the first engine revved, somewhere at the back of the formation. One Harley opening up a long rolling note of something that was not quite music, but was not quite anything else either. Then another. Then 10 more. Then the sound built on itself the way sounds build. When hundreds of people are all expressing the same thing at the same time, and Route 9 held it, and the valley walls threw it back, doubled, and then the cheering started, and Sarah felt it through the soles of her boots, and the palms of her hands, and through the air itself, which moved differently when 400 people are all alive in the same moment. Frank put his arm around her. She leaned against him briefly. Then she straightened up because there was still work to do, and she was Frank Voss's daughter, and they did not rest in the middle of a job. Carol found her an hour later at the bench. The formal portion of the morning had concluded. Pruitt had taken statements. Cross's legal team had departed without filing anything. Cross himself was somewhere in the county deciding what his next move was, though Carol had expressed to Pruitt her expectation that cooperation would prove better arithmetic than resistance, and men like Cross generally did the arithmetic correctly when it counted. Carol set her folder on the bench. She said clearly, "There is one more thing." Sarah looked at her. Carol said, "I've been working with a coalition of veteran advocacy organizations and a historic preservation trust for about 2 years on a legal instrument that protects small businesses on historic routes from exactly this kind of acquisition." She opened the folders to the last document. It requires the business owner's consent and a qualifying historical operating period. She looked at Sarah. Voss Auto has been operating continuously for 37 years on a designated historic corridor. You qualify. Sarah read the document. It was 11 pages. She read all of them. When she finished, she looked up. Carol said, "If Frank signs this, the property is placed in a protected, veteran-owned historic business trust. It cannot be acquired through commercial proceedings. It cannot be condemned for private development, and it is permanently exempt from the type of contract provision Cross used." She said the next word clearly, "Ever." Sarah read the word ever in Carol's mouth. She handed the document to Frank. Frank read it slower than Sarah had. He stopped twice and asked Carol questions that Sarah could not fully follow from her angle, and Carol answered them patiently. When he finished, he set it on the workbench. He looked at it for a long moment. He looked at Sarah. He said clearly, making sure she caught every word, "This was your garage too, before it was ever mine." He put his hand on the document. "I want her name on it too." Carol looked at Sarah. She said, "Done." She took out a pen and wrote Sarah's name into the document in 2 places. She said, "Sign on the last page, both of you." They signed. The afternoon moved through itself. Iron Road members who had trades put them to use without being asked. An electrician from the Martinsburg chapter identified the overhead wiring in the main bay as 30 years out of code and spent 3 hours bringing it current. 2 members who had done construction work replaced the bay door track that had been grinding for a decade. A welder fabricated a new steel workbench extension that Frank had been meaning to add for years and never gotten to. Dale Buckner arrived back at the garage in the early afternoon with a flat box under his arm. He set it on the bench in front of Sarah and stepped back. She opened it, a 1971 Harley-Davidson voltage regulator. Original. Chrome housing, manufacturer paper intact. He had driven to a supplier in Frederick, Maryland, while the morning was happening. Sarah looked at it. She looked at Dale. He took the notepad. He wrote, put her back together. Sarah picked up the regulator. She walked to the Sportster on the lift. She worked with the same focused attention she always brought to the work. Every step in its right order. Nothing rushed, nothing skipped. The crowd near the bay door went quiet, in the way crowds go quiet when they understand they are watching something that deserves attention. 22 minutes later, she tightened the final fitting. She stepped back. She looked at Dale. Dale climbed on. He started it. The Sportster fired on the second crank, settled into its idle, deep and rolling, and completely alive. A sound that had been waiting since 1971 to be exactly this right again. The crowd in the doorway erupted, genuinely, without reservation. Dale sat on the bike for a moment, with his eyes closed, the way Nora had sat on the Scout in the rain on Tuesday night, and Sarah recognized the expression because it was the same expression, the expression of someone receiving confirmation that something important still existed in the world. He opened his eyes. He looked at Sarah. He said something she caught completely. He said, worth every month of waiting. The sign went up in the late afternoon. 2. Iron Road members on ladders. Dark oak letters burned deep into the wood by someone who had brought the materials and done this kind of work before. Sarah watched them mounted above the bay door over the old Voss Auto and Cycle sign that had been there since 1987. When they stepped down, she read it. Voss Garage, established 1986. And below, on a smaller metal plaque, no one left on the road. Frank stood beside her and looked at it. He did not say anything for a long time. Sarah took his hand. She did not sign anything. She did not write anything. She just stood next to him and looked at the sign and held his hand. He pressed her hand once. She felt it. Then he laughed. Quietly. The particular laugh of someone who is surprised by joy, who had stopped expecting it, and is not quite sure whether to trust it, but is willing to try. Nora found them there. She stood on Sarah's other side. The three of them looked at the sign in the late afternoon light. Nora said, clearly enough for Sarah to read, my husband Cal used to say that the road knows who belongs on it. She paused. I never completely believed him. She looked at the sign. I think I was wrong. Sarah took the notepad one more time. She wrote, did she ask about the garage, the woman you were riding toward? Nora smiled. She said first thing she asked when she could talk was whether I had made it there safely. I told her I had help. She said what kind? I said, a 23-year-old mechanic on Route 9 who did not ask my name first. She looked at Sarah. She said to tell you thank you. Sarah wrote, tell her the road has rules. Nora read it. She looked at Sarah for a moment. Then she said, she will know what that means. She said it like a fact, the same weight as any other fact. Road conditions. Engine specifications. The distance between two places on a map. The evening came down over the valley slowly, the light going gold, and then amber, and then the particular blue of West Virginia dusk that sits between the ridge lines and makes everything look like a painting of itself. Riders started their engines one by one, and pulled back onto Route 9, heading in both directions. The sound of each departure, a note in something that kept building even as it diminished. The trucks went last, air brakes and diesel, the lead driver stopping to shake Frank's hand a second time, and Sarah's hand, too, holding it in both of his for a moment before he let go. Pruitt stopped on his way to his car. He said to Frank, "The Attorney General's office will be in touch Monday." He said, "You did the right thing filing." He looked at Sarah. He said, "Both of you." Carol shook Frank's hand, and then Sarah's hand, and then held Sarah's hand for an extra beat and said directly, carefully, "A long time ago, a young woman broke down alone on a mountain road after dark. A mechanic charged her. Nothing said she looked like she needed the money more than he did." She paused. "I have been looking for a way to even that out for 20 years. She looked at the garage. "I think this is it." She got in her car and drove back toward Morgantown. By 7 in the evening, the road was quiet. Route 9, running empty in both directions, through the valley the way it ran most evenings, the way it had run for decades, while the interstates carried the speed and the volume and the efficiency, and this road carried the people who needed something different. The ones who were not running toward a deadline, but toward something they could not quite name yet. Sarah locked the bay door from the inside at 7:40. She walked through the garage, doing the end-of-day check she had done every working day since Frank started letting her close up. Tools in their places, lift lowered, parts bins covered. The new wiring overhead burning evenly, without the flicker the old wiring had produced for years. The Sportster sat in the center of the floor, fully restored, every component exactly right. 53 years old, and as complete as the day it left the factory, more complete in some ways because it had been put back together with the knowledge of what it had survived. Sarah stood next to it and put her hand on the fuel tank. She thought about Tuesday night, the rain coming through the floor, the headlight horizontal on the road surface, the woman on her hands and knees in the westbound lane, favoring her right side, looking up with those gray eyes that did not ask for pity. She thought about the regulator in its paper wrapping, the number 52,000 sitting in the back of her mind like a bruise she had not been pressing on. The decision that was not really a decision because some things are not decisions. They are simply what you do when you understand what kind of person you are. She thought about what Cross had said. "I did not think anyone would show up for a deaf girl in a dead-end town." She thought about 400 motorcycles on Route 9 in the October morning light. She had spent 23 years learning to exist in a world built for people who could hear it. Learning to read lips, read floors, read the vibration of things. Learning that the information she needed was always present, always available, just carried in a different medium than the one most people were paying attention to. She had never once believed the world owed her anything for that difficulty. But she understood now, made a companion habit of believing that the world would not offer anything either. That whatever came to her, she would have to reach for alone with her own hands and her own attention. She had not known until this morning that 400 people could feel a single act of kindness all the way from Pittsburgh. She had not known that the road keeps its own accounting. She picked up the notepad from the bench. She looked at the accumulated writing from the day. Carol's careful handwriting, Nora's left-handed block letters, imperfect and completely legible, Dale's large mechanic script, Frank's careful large words, her own handwriting woven between all of them, the ongoing conversation of a day that had started in a rain-wet ditch on a Tuesday night and had arrived here. She tore out the pages. She set them on the workbench in order. She would put them on the wall tomorrow with the photographs. Not because they were her story, because they were the story the road had told today, and the road deserved to have it remembered. She turned off the bay light and left the small work lamp on above the Sportster. She walked through the office and out the side door into the parking apron. Frank was in the old lawn chair beside the office door, a mug of coffee in both hands, looking at Route 9. Sarah sat on the step beside him and leaned against the door frame and looked at the road too. The sign above the bay door caught the light from the overhead fixture. Voss Garage, established 1986. No one left on the road. They sat for a while. The valley was quiet. Occasional traffic on Route 9. The ordinary movement of ordinary evening. Nothing urgent, nothing running from anything. Just people going from one place to another, the way people always have on roads that go somewhere worth going. Frank moved. Sarah felt it through the step. He was reaching into his shirt pocket. He produced a folded piece of paper and held it out to her. She took it. She opened it. It was not the bank letter. That had been dealt with. The money counted and banded and deposited that afternoon by Dale, who had driven to the branch in Martinsburg personally and stood at the teller window until it was processed and texted Frank a photo of the receipt. This was a different piece of paper, older. The fold lines worn soft, the kind of wear that comes from being opened and refolded many times over many years. The handwriting on it was not Frank's. Sarah tilted it toward the light from the bay window to read it. It was a note, short, dated 2004. Written in a woman's handwriting that Sarah had seen in one other place, on the birthday cards Frank kept in the bottom drawer of the desk. In a rubber-banded stack she had found once when she was 12 and had carefully put back and never mentioned. On those birthday cards, she had spent hours as a girl studying the loops of the letters, the way the ink pressed harder on certain words, the way her mother's hand had moved across the paper. She had memorized that handwriting without meaning to. The way you memorize the faces of people you love, not by trying, but by looking so many times that the image becomes part of you. The note said, "She is going to be all right. She is going to be more than all right. Keep the lights on, Frank. She will find her way back to them." Sarah read it twice. She looked at the date. 2004. The year her mother died. She had been 6 years old. She looked at Frank. He was looking at Route 9. His face was the face of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally set it down in the right place. He looked at her. He said clearly, making sure she caught every word, "She wrote that 2 days before she died. She made me promise to give it to you when you needed it more than I did." Sarah looked at the note again. She looked at the light on the road. She looked at the sign above the bay door. She folded the note along its old fold lines and held it against her chest for a moment. Then she put it in her shirt pocket next to the empty paper wrapping from the voltage regulator that she had placed there on Tuesday night and had not taken out. She looked at Frank. She signed, "Thank you." The same sign Nora had made that morning in the parking apron, brought to the lips and extended outward palm up. The first sign Nora had learned, the one that mattered most. Frank looked at her hands. He looked at her face. He nodded. The nod of a man who does not need anything added to the moment. They sat for a while longer. The October night settled over the valley. The stars came out above the eastern ridge. The density of stars that exists in places where the light has not yet reached from the cities. The kind of sky that makes you understand why people have always looked up at it and felt something they could not name. Sarah went inside after midnight. She made coffee in the old machine. She sat at the bench and looked at the Sportster in the small circle of the work lamp. She pulled her notepad toward her. She turned to a clean page. She wrote in small, careful letters at the top, "No one left on the road." She sat with that for a moment. Then she began to write the account of Tuesday night. The rain and the floor vibrating, and the headlight horizontal on the wet pavement. She wrote it the way she fixed engines, starting at the front and working back, every step in its right order. Nothing rushed, nothing skipped. She wrote until her hand was tired. She set the pen down. She looked at the Sportster. She looked at the sign through the bay window, visible from inside if you knew where to look. She turned off the work lamp. The garage went dark. Outside, the light above the bay door stayed on the same overhead fixture Frank had installed in 1988, the one he had never replaced because it kept working, and he saw no reason to fix what was not broken. It lit the sign. It lit the edge of the parking apron. It lit a small portion of Route 9 in both directions, enough to be seen from a distance, enough to be recognized for what it was by anyone still out there on the road who needed to know that someone was still in. 1 week later, on a Tuesday night, Sarah was driving home from a parts run in Martinsburg when she saw it. A small sedan on the shoulder of Route 9 hazard lights, blinking in the dark. She had taken this road 1,000 times. She knew its rhythms. Something sitting still on it at night always meant something. She pulled over. A young woman was standing beside the car. 20, maybe 21. She had the look of someone who'd been holding herself together through sheer will for about 40 minutes and was approaching the limit of what will alone could accomplish. She held up her phone when Sarah got out of the truck, and Sarah could see the dead battery icon on the screen. Sarah held up her own phone. She opened the Notes app and held it out. The young woman looked at it. She typed, "I cannot hear you. I am deaf. My car died and my phone just died and I do not know what to do." Sarah read it. She looked at the young woman's face. She recognized the particular combination of exhaustion and relief that appears on a person's face when they realize, after a stretch of time alone in a difficult situation, that someone has stopped. Sarah took the phone back. She typed, "I know. I am deaf too. Let me look at the car." She got her kit from the truck. She crouched beside the sedan and looked at the engine in the beam of her flashlight, moving through the check the way she always did, starting at the front and working back. It took her 6 minutes to find the loose connection on the battery terminal, corroded just enough to break contact, simple enough to fix with what she had in her kit. She tightened it. She stood up. She held out the young woman's key. The young woman looked at her. She typed on Sarah's phone, "How much do I owe you?" Sarah typed back, "The road has rules. You will figure them out." The young woman read it. She looked up. She looked at Sarah the way people look at someone who has just said something they did not know they needed to hear. Sarah handed her a card. Small plain printed simply Voss Garage Route 9. Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. And below that, in Frank's handwriting, because he had insisted on adding it when they ordered the cards, "No one left on the road." The young woman held the card for a moment. Then she looked at Sarah and signed something. Simple. One sign careful, deliberate, the sign she clearly knew well from long practice. "Thank you." Sarah signed it back. She watched the sedan's taillights pull onto Route 9 and grow small in the distance and finally disappear around the long bend heading east. She stood on the shoulder for a moment in the cold October dark. Route 9 ran in both directions through the valley, Empty now in both directions, the road doing what roads do at night. In places the interstates have not swallowed, holding its quiet, holding its history, holding the particular patience of something that has been here long enough to know that morning always comes. Sarah got back in her truck. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel, looking at the road ahead of her. Then she drove home, back along Route 9, toward the garage, toward the light Frank always left on above the bay door, toward the sign that said what it meant and meant what it said. The light was on when she turned into the apron. It was always on.